I never thought the home I poured my soul into would one day become the center of a family war. To me, this house was not just four walls and a roof, it was the map of my life, each brick laid with sacrifice, each corner filled with memories. Every scratch on the wooden floors had a story, every window had once framed a precious moment. When I first bought this house with my late husband, it was nothing more than a modest building with peeling paint and a leaking roof. The garden was wild, choked with weeds, and the front gate leaned on one rusty hinge. But to us, it was a dream, something we could fix with time, patience, and love. We were young then, armed with hope and the belief that hard work could conquer anything. And slowly, year by year, we turned this place into a home. I still remember the afternoons when my husband painted the walls while I stitched curtains from old fabric. We didn't have money to buy new ones, but that never stopped us. Our children's laughter used to echo down the hallway as they played hide-and-seek, their tiny footsteps thundering across the stairs. I can still hear my son's giggles when he'd sneak into the kitchen to steal fresh bread from the oven, thinking I didn't notice. Those moments are engraved in my heart, as permanent as the foundation beneath the house. My husband passed away far too early. I was left with 2 children and a mountain of responsibilities. There were nights I cried quietly so they wouldn't hear, then wiped my tears and went to work the next morning. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 shifts in a row, to keep food on the table and ensure the mortgage was paid. I sold my wedding jewelry during one particularly difficult winter, just so we could keep the lights on. But I never regretted it, because the house was my promise to my children, a safe place where they could always return. Years rolled on. My son, Daniel, grew tall and serious, always with that determined jaw like his father. My daughter, Lily, inherited my love of books and would spend hours curled up in the living room chair. When they both went off to college, I was proud, though the house felt painfully quiet without them. I told myself the silence was temporary. One day, they would return, and the house would once again echo with family. Daniel did return, but not in the way I had imagined. He brought with him a young woman, his wife, Clara. At first, I welcomed her with all the warmth I could muster. She was polite, charming even, and I thought she would bring joy to Daniel's life. I opened my heart and my home to her, eager to treat her as my own daughter. After all, marriage is not just the union of 2 people, but of 2 families. The first months were pleasant enough. Clara would compliment my cooking, bring me flowers occasionally, and sit with me in the evenings to talk. I thought, perhaps naively, that she respected me. But slowly, I began to notice small changes, shadows beneath her smile, sharpness in her tone when she thought Daniel wasn't listening. At first, I brushed it off. Living under one roof with your in-laws can be difficult, I told myself. It was only natural for adjustments to take time. Still, the house began to feel different. Clara started redecorating without asking, changing curtains, moving furniture, replacing photographs with her own framed pictures. My husband's portrait, which had hung in the living room for decades, was suddenly moved to a corner of the hallway. When I asked about it, Clara laughed lightly, saying, "Oh, it just didn't match the decor." That was the first sting. I watched Daniel grow quieter, caught between loyalty to me and the desire to please his wife. He rarely challenged her, and I couldn't bring myself to cause conflict. So, I stayed silent, swallowing the hurt, convincing myself it was just my imagination. After all, what mattered most was my son's happiness, wasn't it? But deep down, I could feel a storm gathering. Clara's eyes sometimes lingered too long on the house itself, on its polished wooden banisters, the antique furniture, the garden I had tended with aching knees. She spoke often of modernizing the place, or how it would be perfect for entertaining friends. There was a hunger in her words that unsettled me. I didn't yet know just how far she would go, but I sensed it. Like the first rumble of thunder on the horizon, her ambition for what was mine grew louder with each passing day. And so I lived in my beloved home, surrounded by memories, yet walking carefully as though on glass. I told myself everything was fine, that families always have disagreements, that I was being overly sensitive. But one evening, as I stood by the window watching the sun dip behind the garden fence, I couldn't shake the uneasy thought whispering through my mind, what if the very house I built with love becomes the battlefield that tears my family apart? At first, it was the small remarks. Words so light, so carefully disguised, that an outsider might not have even noticed them. But I did. One Sunday morning, as I prepared breakfast, Clara strolled into the kitchen in her silk robe, eyes scanning the cabinets as though she were taking inventory. She sighed and said, almost offhandedly, "This place has such potential. Once it's ours, I'll have the whole kitchen remodeled. Granite countertops, modern lighting, maybe even an island in the center." I froze, a wooden spoon still in my hand. Ours. The word rang in my ears. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. She said it with certainty, as though the ownership of the house was already written in fate. I forced a smile and replied softly, "It's a sturdy kitchen. It has served me well for years." She only smirked. "Yes, but it's old-fashioned. Don't you think it's time for a change?" Daniel entered then, kissed his wife's cheek, and the conversation ended. But the word ours lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. The weeks that followed only deepened my unease. Clara began referring to the house in ways that erased me entirely. When friends visited, she would give them tours, her arm extended proudly as she said things like, "This will be the nursery one day," or, "We're thinking of knocking down this wall to make more space." Never we as in the family. Always we as in herself and Daniel. One evening, I overheard them in the living room. Their voices were low, but the walls of this old house carry sound like secrets unwilling to stay hidden. "Why can't she just sign it over already?" Clara whispered, irritation lacing her words. "She's still alive, Clara," Daniel said, his voice weary. "But she's old. It's only a matter of time. We could save years if she just gave it to us now. Do you know how much money we'd save not buying our own place? This house is worth a fortune." There was silence, then Daniel's quiet sigh. "I'll talk to her someday. Just, don't push." My heart ached at those words. Not only because of Clara's greed, but because my own son seemed too weak to protect me from it. I began noticing other shifts. Clara no longer asked for my opinion, she issued commands. "Move this vase to the other table. Don't use the living room during the evenings, Daniel, and I need it for our guests." She rearranged the furniture, changed curtains I had lovingly sewn, and criticized my garden as outdated. One morning, I discovered she had replaced the nameplate outside the gate. My late husband had carved it himself years ago, our family name etched into wood. Now, a sleek, metallic plate gleamed in its place, engraved with Daniel and Clara. I felt my breath catch. To her, it wasn't our family's home. It was already her house. The disrespect grew bolder when guests were around. At a dinner with some of Daniel's colleagues, Clara raised her glass and declared, "This is our forever home. We're just waiting to make it official." Her words hung heavy in the air. Laughter followed from her friends, but I sat still, my hands clenched beneath the table. Daniel glanced at me, shame flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. I excused myself early, retreating to my bedroom where the photographs of my husband still sat on the nightstand. I touched the frame gently, whispering, "Did we build all this just so I could be erased?" The final straw of that season came when Clara entered my room one afternoon without knocking. She looked around critically, then said, "This space would make a perfect home office. Don't you think? Of course, once you move downstairs, we'll renovate it." I felt my chest tighten. "Move downstairs?" I asked quietly. "Yes," she said, with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It would be safer for you. The stairs are dangerous at your age. Besides, we'll need the upper floor when we start a family. Surely you don't mind, do you?" Her words were wrapped in the guise of concern, but I saw the truth. She wasn't worried about my safety, she wanted to claim more of the house for herself. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the garden where my husband and I had planted roses decades ago. My silence must have irritated her, because she added sharply, "It's only practical. You can't expect to keep all this space forever." When she left the room, I finally let the tears fall. That night, Daniel knocked softly on my door. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "Clara, she means well. She just wants us to have a future here. You know how expensive houses are now." I looked at my son, my boy whom I had raised with love and sacrifice. The boy who once held my hand tightly on his first day of school, who had cried into my shoulder when his father died. Now, he stood before me, torn between me and the woman who sought to strip me of everything I held dear. I wanted to shout, to remind him of the nights I worked while he slept, of the food I skipped so he could eat, of the years I carried this family alone. But instead, I swallowed the words. I simply said, "Daniel, this house is more than bricks and wood. It is the life your father and I built. Don't forget that." He nodded, guilt shadowing his face, but said nothing more. And so, the days marched on, filled with tension so thick it choked the air. I could see Clara's impatience growing, her eyes gleaming each time she looked at the house. But I kept my silence, holding my ground, waiting. Because deep inside, I knew the storm was coming. And when it arrived, I would need more than tears and memories. I would need proof, something undeniable, that this house, my sanctuary, was not hers to claim. And I already knew where to find it. The evening began like any other, with the clatter of cutlery and the faint smell of roasted chicken drifting from the kitchen. I had spent the afternoon preparing dinner for the three of us, rosemary potatoes, a salad, and the same chicken recipe my late husband had loved. Cooking, for me, was always an act of love. I thought perhaps, if we sat together as a family, the atmosphere might soften. But I should have known better. Daniel sat at the head of the table, tired from work, his tie loosened. Clara glided in, dressed elegantly for a simple family meal, her perfume filling the room before she even spoke. She looked at the table with a faint smile, but her eyes carried that usual glint, sharp, appraising. We began eating in silence. For a few moments, I allowed myself to believe it might be a peaceful evening. Then Clara put down her fork, dabbed her lips with a napkin, and asked, "So, Mother, have you thought about the future of this house?" I froze. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew the answer already. Clara leaned forward, her tone falsely sweet. "Well, you're not getting any younger. Surely you've considered what will happen when you're no longer here. Houses like this shouldn't sit in limbo. Daniel and I need stability. We need to plan for our children." I placed my fork gently on the plate. "This house is not in limbo. It's my home." Clara gave a small laugh, shaking her head. Of course. But realistically, you won't be able to manage it forever. It's only natural that it becomes ours. Isn't that right, Daniel?" Daniel swallowed hard, avoiding my eyes. "Clara," he murmured, "maybe we shouldn't." "No, Daniel," she cut him off, her voice sharper now. "We need to be honest. Your mother should understand." I felt the air thicken around us. My pulse drummed in my ears, but I kept my voice calm. "And what if I'm not ready to hand it over?" Clara tilted her head, smirking as though she had anticipated the question. "Then you'd be selfish. Do you expect us to spend our best years in a cramped apartment while this place sits underused? You have more space than you need. We're a young couple, we deserve to build our lives here." I stared at her, struggling to believe the audacity of her words. "This house is mine. I built this life with my husband. I raised my children here. It's not a prize to be handed over like some gift at a party." Her smile faltered, replaced by a cold edge. "With all due respect, you won't live forever. Why not make things easier for everyone and sign it over now? The clink of Daniel's fork dropping onto his plate cut through the tension. Clara, enough, he said, his voice low but firm. This isn't the time. She turned on him, eyes flashing. If not now, when? How long are we supposed to wait? Until she stopped herself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. My heart clenched. She couldn't even finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant, until I die. I looked at my son, hoping, praying he would defend me. He rubbed his forehead, weary, and muttered, "Let's just eat." But the damage was done. The rest of the meal passed in silence. I barely touched my food, the chicken on my plate growing cold. Clara, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. She hummed lightly, scrolled through her phone between bites, and occasionally glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite name, something between triumph and impatience. When dinner ended, she stood, smoothed her dress, and said cheerfully, "Well, I'm meeting a friend for coffee. Don't wait up." She kissed Daniel on the cheek and left, her heels clicking like hammers against the wooden floor. The front door shut behind her, and the silence felt heavier than before. Daniel finally looked at me. His eyes were tired, guilt-ridden. "Mom," he whispered, she doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I gave him a long, steady look. "Yes, she does." He dropped his gaze, unable to argue. I wanted to yell, to demand why he allowed his wife to speak to me like that in my own home. But instead, I took a deep breath and said quietly, "Daniel, this house is my heart. It is not hers to claim." He nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I know." But the way he said it, hesitant, unsure, made me realize something painful. He might know, but he didn't have the strength to stand against her. That night, I sat in the living room long after Daniel had gone to bed. The house was quiet, shadows stretching across the walls. My husband's portrait hung above the fireplace, his steady gaze watching me as though he could see the turmoil inside me. I whispered to him, "Do you see what's happening? She wants to erase me. She wants to erase us." I closed my eyes, remembering his laugh, his warm hands, the way we had built this place from nothing. Clara thought she saw only walls and market value. But I knew better. This was a home woven with love, sacrifice, and memory. And as I sat there in the silence, one thing became clear: I couldn't remain passive anymore. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. And I had to be ready to face it. The following morning, Clara's footsteps echoed through the hallway long before I had risen. She spoke loudly on the phone, her voice sharp and commanding, as though she wanted me to hear. "Yes, the guest rooms are spacious. Once we're settled, we'll redecorate. Oh, don't worry, this house will be ours soon enough." I stood by the kitchen doorway, my hands gripping the frame. She said it so casually, so confidently, as if the matter had already been decided. When she finally noticed me, she ended the call with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her tone dripping with false cheer. "I was just talking to a friend about plans." "Plans?" I asked. She poured herself coffee, unfazed. "Yes. Redecorating, renovating, making this place suitable for our family. Honestly, the furniture is so dated. Don't you think it's time for a change?" I held her gaze. "Clara, this is my home. It will not be turned into your project." She set down the mug with a little too much force. "You're clinging to the past. This house needs fresh energy. Besides, what use is it to you? You occupy one room and shuffle through the same halls every day. It's wasteful." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see the wound. "You speak as though I don't belong here." Her lips curved into a smirk. "That's because, in truth, you don't. Not anymore. This house is mine now." The words hung heavy, final, like the crack of a judge's gavel. At that moment, Daniel entered, his tie half knotted, clearly in a rush for work. He froze as he caught the last of her words. Clara, what did you just say? She turned to him, not a hint of shame in her face. I said the truth. This house should be ours. It's time your mother accepts that. Daniel's eyes flicked to me, full of helplessness. He rubbed the back of his neck. Clara, please, don't start this again. This isn't starting, she snapped. This is reality. We deserve this house. We're the future, Daniel. Don't you see? She's the past. I felt my breath catch, but I steadied myself. I refused to let her break me. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the side cabinet. My hands didn't tremble as I pulled open the drawer, though my heart pounded like a drum. From within, I withdrew a single envelope, thick, official, its seal unbroken. I turned, holding it before me like a shield. Clara's confident smile faltered for the first time. This, I said softly, but with iron in my voice, is the deed to this house. My name. My signature. My right. You may sneer, you may claim, you may even try to bully your way into believing this place belongs to you. But one piece of paper speaks louder than all your words. Her face drained of color. For once, she had no quick reply. Daniel looked between us, stunned into silence. I stepped closer, my voice low but unwavering. This house is not yours, Clara. It will never be yours. And the more you try to take it from me, the clearer it becomes that you do not value this family, you only value possession. She opened her mouth, closed it, then forced a brittle laugh. Paper doesn't last forever. Maybe not, I replied, sliding the envelope back into the drawer and shutting it firmly. But neither does arrogance. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Clara's eyes burned with frustration, but she turned on her heel and stormed out, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. Daniel remained frozen in place, guilt written across his face. Mom, he began, but the words faltered. He lowered his head and whispered, I'm sorry. Then he followed her, leaving me alone with the echo of my heartbeat and the quiet strength of the document that had just saved me, for now. But deep down, I knew this battle was far from over. Clara didn't speak to me for 2 days. She drifted through the house like a storm cloud, silent yet charged with electricity, every glance sharp enough to cut. Daniel tried to keep the peace, but his attempts only widened the gap. I overheard whispered arguments behind their bedroom door, Clara's voice rising in anger, Daniel's low and pleading. On the third morning, she emerged from their room with a smile that unsettled me more than her silence. She was dressed immaculately, her hair pinned back, her lipstick a shade darker than usual. She carried herself as if she had already won a war. At breakfast, she slid a folder across the table toward me. Since you're so fond of documents, she said sweetly, I thought you might like to look at these. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed pages, legal forms, contracts, transfer requests. My eyes scanned the words, and the truth struck me like ice. Clara had already spoken to a lawyer. She was preparing paperwork to transfer ownership of the house. I looked up, my stomach sinking. You went this far? Clara tilted her head, sipping her coffee. I'm simply being proactive. You can fight me all you want, but eventually the outcome will be the same. This house is wasted on you. Daniel and I will raise a family here, and you'll find somewhere more suitable. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Clara, maybe this isn't. She slammed her cup down, cutting him off. No, Daniel. This is exactly what it is. She can't cling to the past forever. If she won't let go willingly, then we'll take the proper steps. I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and pushed them back across the table. My voice was calm, though my insides shook. Do what you think you must. But remember, Clara, greed has a way of undoing itself. You may believe you've cornered me, but I am not as powerless as you imagine. Her smile flickered, just for a moment, before returning sharper than ever. We'll see about that. I knew then that this was no longer about family. It was about conquest. And Clara would not stop until she either had the house or destroyed herself trying. I knew I couldn't face this alone. Pride can be a comfortable companion until it becomes a blindfold. I had been proud of my perseverance for years, but Clara's ruthless certainty showed me how fragile solitude could be. Early the next morning, before Clara woke and before the house had filled with the small noises of daily life, I bundled a shawl around my shoulders and walked 2 streets down to see Mr. Sharma, the lawyer who had overseen my husband's small business papers years ago and who had always spoken to me as if I were family. The clinic of his office smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, the kind of smell that promised steadiness. He looked the same as always, hair more silver now, glasses perched low on his nose, the gentle impatience of a man who dealt with other people's storms for a living. "Sit down, Asha," he said, using my first name as my friends and family did. "What brings you here so early?" When I told him everything, the offhand comments, the folders she'd slid across the table, the word "ours" like a needle in my ear, his expression hardened in a way that made me feel less alone. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he folded his hands and sighed. "You did well to come," he said finally. "Families can be complicated, and lawyers can be worse company than they're worth when emotions run high. But there are legal protections you must know about. The law is not poetry, it is practical." I nodded. "I need to protect my home." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "First, the deed, keep the original where it cannot be tampered with. If any attempt is made to record a transfer, it must be signed by you, in the presence of witnesses, and then registered at the land office. Second, if you are concerned about future scheming, we should consider updating your will and possibly establishing a life estate or a trust. These tools can specify that you retain the right to live in the house for the rest of your life, while control or ownership passes at a later date to beneficiaries you choose, say grandchildren or a charity. That way, your son and his wife cannot simply take it." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. "If you want, you can place the property in a revocable trust. In plain terms, you keep control during your lifetime, but the terms of transfer are written and legally binding, and it's harder to manipulate after you're gone. Or we could put in specific conditions, such as a clause that the house cannot be sold without the consent of a designated third party. There are many possibilities." "Will she be able to challenge it?" I asked, the fear in my voice raw. "Anyone can challenge a document," he said bluntly. "But a well-drafted will or trust, executed correctly, is not easily overturned. The key is to be proactive and meticulous. Keep original copies in safe places, do not sign anything under pressure, and most of all, be transparent about what you're doing with people you trust." He paused, then added, softer, "And Asha, do be careful. People like Clara sometimes react badly when they sense their plans are thwarted. Make sure you have witnesses when relevant, and if necessary, we can look at a restraining order if she becomes abusive." His words landed like a comforting hand on my shoulder. It wasn't that I wanted to punish my own child and his wife, but I wanted boundaries, clarity, and above all, to stop being frightened in my own home. On my way back, I stopped at Mrs. Patel's, my neighbor of 30 years, who had watched my children grow and had always offered tea and pragmatic counsel. Over steaming cups in her tiny kitchen, I told her about Mr. Sharma's options. She clucked and shook her head in dismay at Clara's audacity but then rubbed her hands together. "You know what you must do, Beta," she said. "Not just lawyers and papers. Tell someone trusted in the family, an uncle, your cousin, someone who will stand with you. Let them witness. Strength in numbers, yes? And take photographs of anything she changes without your permission, nameplates, frames, locks. Small things become proof." I left with a list in my hand and a mind that felt suddenly busy with purpose. Between Mr. Sharma's legal counsel and Mrs. Patel's practical instincts, a plan began to form, simple and deliberate. First, gather all originals, deed, title, tax receipts, and the old mortgage papers. Second, update the will, make it clear who inherits and under what conditions. Third, create a life estate clause so I could remain in the house for life. Fourth, place a copy of the primary deed safely with Mr. Sharma's office, and bring along 2 witnesses, people who had no reason to lie about the facts. That afternoon, while Clara was at work and Daniel out for what sounded like a long meeting, I sat in the dining room and took each important paper from their hiding places and set them on the table. Each sheet of paper felt like a small pillar supporting the house itself. As I handled them, memories rose: mortgage notices with my husband's handwriting, a letter from the bank acknowledging the final payment, the map of the plot we had drawn ourselves. I called Mr. Sharma and arranged for him to come by the next day to go over the details and help draft the necessary documents. I also asked him to keep one original in his custody for safekeeping. He agreed without hesitation. That evening, I tested the waters. Clara returned earlier than usual, her manner as composed as ever, but beneath it I could see an odd impatience. She glanced at the papers on the table with a quick, assessing look and then asked, "Making plans?" I set my cup down and met her gaze. "Yes," I said. "I'm making plans. For everyone's sake." She smiled, too practiced. "Good. Maybe when your head is clear, you'll see things our way." "No," I said, quietly. "I don't think so." She left it at that, but I could tell my words had irritated her. Over the next few days, life took on the rhythm of quiet preparation. I met Mr. Sharma in his office. We spoke of trusts and life estates, of contingencies and clear language that would make my intentions obvious and legally solid. He drafted a document that named my grandchildren as primary beneficiaries, with a clause specifically stating that I retained a lifetime right to occupy the house and that any changes required my explicit consent. He also wrote a clause addressing potential claims from in-laws, making it clear that transfers without my signature would be void. He advised me to remain calm and not to use these documents as weapons in casual arguments, save them for when they count. "Timing matters," he said. "Surprises work best in short, decisive moments, rather than in drawn-out public battles where tempers flare." When I walked out of his office, the envelope with the signed draft in my bag felt heavier than any ledger I'd ever carried. It was not just paper, it was the culmination of decades of labor and love, translated into words that the law would recognize. That night, as I set the draft back into the drawer where the old deed lived, I felt a steadiness I had not felt for months. Clara could continue to smirk and plan parties in rooms she did not own. She could try to rehang pictures and change plates. But I was no longer drifting. I had prepared, and I had allies. Whatever storm she intended to bring, I would face it with documents at hand and people who knew the truth. And for the first time in a long while, as I turned off the light and settled into the small, familiar quiet of my bedroom, I slept with the soft, slow certainty that came from knowing I had taken a step toward protecting the life my husband and I had built together. The calm did not last long. Clara was not a woman who tolerated silence. She thrived on tension, on spectacle, on the feeling that she was one step ahead. A week after I signed the documents with Mr. Sharma, I returned from the market to find her in the living room, standing on a stool, hammer in hand. The portrait of my husband that had hung above the fireplace for 30 years lay on the floor, propped against the wall. In its place, she was hanging a glossy framed photograph of herself and Daniel from their honeymoon. I dropped the shopping bag to the floor. "What are you doing?" She didn't turn around. "Updating the house." That painting was depressing. "This is brighter, happier." "That's not a painting," I said, my voice sharp. "That's my husband. This was his home before you even knew our family." She stepped down from the stool, dusting her hands. "Exactly. Past tense. Was. You need to stop clinging to ghosts, Mother. Daniel and I are the future. This house should reflect that." I bent down and lifted the portrait from the floor, my fingers trembling. "You will not disrespect him. Not here. Not in this home." She smirked. "You think paper will protect you forever? A deed, a trust, a will, it won't keep you warm at night. It won't stop time. You can wave your documents around, but eventually you'll be gone, and this house will still be ours. I set the portrait back on the mantel, directly in front of her new frame. This house will never be yours. Not while I breathe. For the first time, she didn't smirk. She laughed. Low, mocking, with a cruelty that made my stomach twist. That evening, Daniel came home to a house heavy with silence. He noticed the double frames on the mantel, the air brittle between us. "What happened now?" he asked, weary. I told him in measured words, careful not to let my anger spill over. Clara stood by, arms folded, rolling her eyes at every sentence. When I finished, Daniel sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered. "You don't have to," Clara said smoothly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "There's an easy solution. She can move into a retirement apartment. We'll take over here, renovate, build our family. Everyone gets what they need." "Everyone?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it stopped her cold. "You mean you. Not Daniel. Not me. Only you." She opened her mouth to retort, but Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. "Clara, enough. Please." But I saw it clearly, his voice had no authority. He was pleading, not commanding. He was caught between love and duty, between the woman he married and the mother who raised him. And Clara knew it. That's why she pressed harder. Later that night, as I sat alone in my room, I heard their muffled voices through the wall. Clara's sharp, insistent, Daniel's low, hesitant. And then her words rose, clear enough to pierce the plaster. "If she doesn't step aside, we'll make her. One way or another." I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart pound. It was no longer an argument. It was a declaration of war. And the battleground was my home. The following days felt like living under siege. Clara moved through the house with a kind of defiant ownership, opening cupboards that weren't hers, moving furniture a few inches at a time, as if to test how far she could push me. Daniel avoided me more and more, retreating into his work, leaving me alone with her sharp smiles and cutting remarks. One evening, I caught her standing by the window, phone pressed to her ear, her tone low and conspiratorial. "Yes, it's nearly done," she said. "She's stubborn, but it won't matter soon. Once the papers are in order, she'll have no choice. The house will be ours." I stepped into the room, and she jumped slightly, then turned with a mask of sweetness. "Oh, you startled me. Just chatting with a friend." I looked her squarely in the eye. "I heard enough." She shrugged, unconcerned. "Then you know. You can fight, but it's useless. Everyone gets old. Everyone moves aside eventually." I wanted to scream, but instead I whispered, "Not like this." That night, I called Mr. Sharma again. My hands trembled as I told him what I had overheard. He listened quietly, then said, "Asha, you must prepare yourself. If she is bold enough to involve lawyers already, she may try to force your hand, perhaps through power of attorney, perhaps through pressure on Daniel. We need to tighten your protections." "What else can we do?" I asked, my voice tight. "Two things," he replied. "First, register the trust immediately. That will lock the house under legal safeguards. Second, document everything, dates, words, witnesses. If it comes to court, you'll need more than indignation. You'll need proof." His words steadied me, but as I set the phone down, I felt the crushing weight of betrayal. Clara was one thing, brazen, greedy, heartless. But Daniel, my own son, too weak to stand, too easily swayed. It was as if the boy I raised had vanished, leaving behind a man who nodded silently while his wife plotted against me. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes my husband had planted, when Clara came outside carrying a box. She dropped it at my feet. Inside were photo albums, old letters, and the embroidered cushions I had stitched when I was first married. "What is this?" I demanded. Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes glittered. "A head start. You'll need these when you move into a smaller place. Don't worry, I'll help pack the rest later." I stared down at the box, my throat tightening. Then, slowly, I straightened and met her gaze. "Clara," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "you may think you've won. But when the time comes, it won't be me who leaves this house. It will be you." Her smile wavered, just for a heartbeat. But then she laughed, high and cruel, and turned back toward the door. I stood among the roses, the thorns pricking my palms as I clenched my fists. The war had been declared, and now the battle lines were drawn. I would not surrender my home. Not to her. Not to anyone. The evening of the confrontation arrived faster than I expected. Clara had invited Daniel's friends over under the guise of a casual dinner, but I knew her true intention: to flaunt her control, to corner me into submission. As the guests began to arrive, the house buzzed with chatter and laughter, but underneath it all, attention crackled like static electricity. Clara moved through the rooms with effortless confidence, directing the staff, rearranging seating, and even adjusting decorations I had placed myself. Each motion, each command, reinforced the illusion that she already owned the house. Finally, unable to endure her mockery any longer, I called the group into the dining room. The laughter dimmed, curious eyes turned toward me. I stood in the center, calm but resolute. Clara arched an eyebrow, her smirk returning. "Oh. Are you going to entertain the guests too, Mother?" she said, with a tone of mockery that could have sliced steel. I ignored her and opened the drawer where I had kept the documents, my last and strongest defense. Slowly, deliberately, I withdrew the envelope that contained the deed, the trust documents, and the signed life estate clause. I placed it on the table so that everyone could see it. "This house," I began, my voice calm but carrying through the room, "belongs to me. Every brick, every wall, every corner was built and maintained with the sweat and love of my family. And while I live, I retain the legal and rightful ownership. These papers," I tapped the envelope, "make it clear. No threats, no scheming, no arrogance will change that fact." The room fell silent. Clara's confident posture wavered for the first time. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Daniel's friends exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. I could see recognition dawning in their eyes. They realized the depth of her audacity. Clara tried to recover, her voice rising. "Paper doesn't make it mine? You're just delaying the inevitable." Once she... I cut her off, raising a hand. "This is not inevitable. The law, combined with my explicit instructions, ensures that this house cannot be taken from me or my chosen heirs. You may try to intimidate me, you may try to manipulate Daniel, but nothing in that envelope can be ignored." A hush settled over the room. Guests who had come to dine and socialize were now witnesses to a battle that went far deeper than furniture or paint colors. It was about respect, legacy, and justice. Clara's face turned pale. Her mouth moved, searching for words, but nothing suitable came. She took a step back, the bravado she had carried like armor now faltering. Daniel, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Clara, maybe we need to step back. I didn't realize how far this went." Her jaw tightened. She shot him a look, sharp and furious, but even she could not challenge the truth of what lay on the table. I remained calm, my hands folded in front of me, my heart steady. The document was more than ink and paper, it was the culmination of decades of life, work, and love. Finally, Clara's shoulders slumped. She looked around the room, at the faces of those who had come to celebrate, and then at me. The words I had feared most, that I had anticipated in my quiet moments, emerged from my own lips without hesitation. "This house was never yours, and it never will be." The tension broke. Clara's composure crumbled, and she turned sharply, storming toward the door. The sound of her heels on the floor echoed like a drumbeat of retreat. Daniel followed, glancing back at me with guilt and realization. He had seen the truth too late, but he had seen it nonetheless. The room was left in silence, the guests uncertain whether to speak, to applaud, or simply leave. I exhaled slowly, a deep and steady breath that felt like reclaiming my life. I looked at the envelope, resting quietly on the table, knowing it had not only secured my home but restored my authority, my dignity, and the peace I had feared lost. For the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. Not because Clara was gone, it was because the truth had been spoken, the power of one document had been revealed, and the foundation I had built with love and perseverance had withstood the storm. And in that calm, I knew the house was finally safe, not just from her hands, but from the fear that had shadowed me for far too long. The days after the confrontation were quieter than I could have imagined. Clara avoided me entirely, speaking only to Daniel when absolutely necessary. Even he seemed subdued, as if the weight of his wife's ambition had finally been measured against reality. For the first time in months, I moved freely through my home, touching the furniture, opening drawers, and walking down the hallways without fear or tension. I spent mornings in the garden, pruning roses and tending to the plants my husband and I had nurtured together. The familiar scents, the feel of soil beneath my fingers, reminded me why I had fought so hard, not for ownership, not for documents, but for the life and memories embedded in every corner of this house. Neighbors noticed the change too. Mrs. Patel stopped by with freshly baked bread, her eyes sparkling. "You look like yourself again," she said warmly. It's about time she learned who really owns this place. I smiled, though the memory of the storm lingered. "It's not about ownership," I said. "It's about respect, and about knowing where you belong." Inside the house, I began cataloging and safeguarding my most precious belongings. Old letters, photographs, and heirlooms were arranged carefully, some placed in secure boxes, others displayed openly to remind anyone who entered that this home carried the legacy of decades. Every item told a story, and now those stories were protected. One afternoon, Daniel approached me, hesitant and unsteady. "Mom." I didn't realize what I was letting happen," he said, his voice low. "I should have spoken up sooner." I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his frame. "Daniel, you are learning. It's never too late to do what's right. But remember, standing by someone else's side doesn't mean you lose your own values." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll make it right. I'll be more careful. I don't want to see this house, or you, hurting again." I believed him. For the first time, I felt that the bond with my son, though tested, was intact. The house, which had been a battlefield, was now a sanctuary again, not because it was safe from external threats, but because the truth of my ownership, and the love that built it, had been reaffirmed. Clara never returned to the house with the same arrogance. Her presence became a reminder of how greed can falter when faced with steadfast resolve. And I, who had once felt powerless, had discovered strength I hadn't known I possessed. At night, I would sit by the fireplace, the same one my husband had loved, and reflect on everything that had happened. I realized that the house, though central to the conflict, was more than wooden walls. It was a symbol of endurance, of legacy, and of the love that withstands even betrayal. In the end, the home was mine, yes, but more importantly, the peace within it had been restored. I could finally breathe again, knowing that the memories of my husband, the joy of raising my children, and the sanctuary of my own life could continue unchallenged. And as I drifted off to sleep each night, I felt a quiet certainty: no document, no argument, and no attempt at theft could ever erase the life and love that built this house. This was home, in every sense of the word. The battle had been hard, the storm fierce, but victory was not about defeating someone, it was about protecting what truly mattered. And in that victory, I found freedom, dignity, and the comfort of knowing that my family's legacy, and my own, would endure for generations to come.